Welcome to Spirit of Truth Church. I'm so glad you're here. And today we're actually going to dive in to our introduction to the book of Revelation. In this introduction, we'll be examining the key things we need to know about how to go about interpreting this book, as it is a very controversial book in many cases. So this video is going to serve as an introductory to our sermon series on Revelation. You can view this if you like. You don't have to in order to get what you want out of the book of Revelation, but it will help so you understand the point of view that I'm coming from and why I'm making the interpretive decisions that I'll be making. There are three things we're going to do in this video. First, we're going to examine the authorship of the book of Revelation. Second, we're going to examine the dating of the book of Revelation. Third, we're going to examine historical, grammatical, literal interpretation, compare the main rules of that method of interpretation to the other various possible ways to interpret this book. Now, in terms of authorship, the early church was nearly unanimous in its assertion that this book was authored by John the disciple. However, even in Alexandria in the early 3rd century, there were people like Dionysius who were arguing against Johannine authorship. These sources would argue that, John never identified himself as a disciple. Instead, he called himself a servant. They would also cite that there's multiple instances of incorrect Greek grammar which don't reflect John's style. So in place of John the disciple, they assert that, maybe it was John the elder or John the presbyter or maybe even John Mark. However, there are a number of good reasons why John the disciple should be considered the author of the book of Revelation. First, we do have mention it 4 times in the book that John is the author. That's Revelation 1:1, 1:4, 1:9, and 22:8. Second, John is called the one who was exiled to the island of Patmos, and this is confirmed by Clement of Alexandria, by Eusebius, and by Irenaeus. So we've got good attestation from that angle. So in conclusion, we've got early church attestation, we've got John's link to being the one who was, John the disciple's link to the one who was being exiled to Patmos, and he's calling himself John within the gospel itself, which seems to indicate that this was a well-known John. Thus, I believe that there is a good reason for us to conclude that John the disciple did write the book of Revelation. Second, we now need to look into dating. There are 2 primary dates offered for the book of Revelation. First is 65 AD. The second is 95 AD. Now there's hermeneutical reasons or interpretive reasons why people select one or the other, but let's see if we can find out other reasons why we should take one over the other. First, there is strong evidence externally for the 95 AD date. Follow along as I read to you the list of names of early church fathers, church writers, and major people in the church and other documents that all attest for the 95 AD date. Now, I'll also include, as I read this list, the date these sources come from. First, we have Hegesippus from 150 AD. We have Irenaeus recording a 95 AD date in 180 AD. Victorinus in 300 AD, Eusebius in 300 AD, Jerome in 400 AD, Sepulsius Severus in 400 AD, the Acts of John in 650 AD, Primasius in 540 AD, Orosius in 600 AD, Andreas in 600 AD, and the Venerable Bede in 700 AD. So again, that's strong attestation throughout the entire period of the church that the book of Revelation was written in 95 AD. Contrarily, the external evidence for the early dating, 65, is as follows. The Syriac version of the New Testament in 500 AD, Arathus in 900 AD, and Theophylact in 1107. Clearly, the preponderance of evidence is for 95 AD, not the other. It's also earlier and better testimony. The second reason that we have to take a later dating, the 95 AD dating, is due to the issues that were going on in the churches mentioned in Revelation at those two times. As you'll see, the history of those churches does not match a 65 AD date, but does match a 95 AD date. First, let's take a look at the Church of Ephesus. You see, if Revelation had a date of 65 AD, then 2 Timothy, which was being written to Timothy when he was pastoring that church of Ephesus, would have been written and sent after Revelation. However, the book of Revelation doesn't mention this letter, and the letters are wildly inconsistent. For example, 2 Timothy does not mention the loss of the first love of Ephesus, nor does it mention the Nicolaitans, which were two serious issues mentioned in Revelation. Additionally, in the 60s, the church did not guard itself well against doctrinal error, as can be seen in Acts 20, 29 through 30, 1 Timothy 1, 3 through 7, and 2 Timothy 2, 17 through 18. Now, finally, Paul wasn't mentioned as well in the book of Revelation, and he actually was there close to that early dating time. So again, it's strikingly odd that none of that's mentioned. Smyrna has a serious problem for a 65 AD date because in his letter to the Philippians from Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, we know that Smyrna was not in existence during the ministry of Paul. So putting Revelation that close means the church probably wasn't even around then. And finally, Laodicea. In Laodicea, we have this issue. Laodicea was known for being rich and extravagant and wealthy and in need of nothing. But in 60 AD, just 5 years prior to the early dating, we find that Laodicea was basically leveled by an earthquake. And it took until 90 AD for them to finish the majority of their major building projects. So again, a 65 AD date is not going to work, but a 95 AD date does. Okay, so again, there's good evidence there to hold to a 95 AD rather than a 65 AD date. For the third topic I'd like to talk about today, I'd like to discuss hermeneutics. And so we're going to hold to a literal, grammatical, historical interpretation of the Bible. This means that we take the words for their face value. We try to find authorial intent. What did the author actually mean? And we don't resort to symbolism unless it's clearly present and explained in the text. There are 4 main rules we need to keep in mind when we engage in interpretation. Rule number 1 is the golden rule of interpretation. When the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. Therefore, take every word as its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate context, studied in the light of related passages and axiomatic and fundamental truths, indicate clearly otherwise. All this means is that we take the Bible as it presents itself. We don't try to find hidden meaning. We don't try to make it mean 2 or more things. We don't try to divine a hidden meaning or pray that the Spirit would reveal the meaning. No, God spoke words and we have meaning. This is actually indicative of something called the covenant of language, which is the idea that God gave us language to be understood. And thus when he communicates through language, he intends to be understood. The idea that people who wrote Scripture didn't know what they meant doesn't make sense. They knew the meaning of the words they were writing down. They may not have had the context, they may not have had the implications, but they knew the meaning of what they were writing, even if it was hard to believe. If we back off on this rule, we give into something called Gnosticism, which is the idea that there is hidden meaning which only a few can access. Anytime someone says that they prayed and found the meaning of the text, they engage in Gnosticism. In other words, there was a meaning that was hidden from everybody else, but somebody who prayed was granted that meaning. This is not only a heresy, but it is a false cultish religion. This idea that knowledge can be obtained in esoteric means, that knowledge is hidden, that the Bible does not speak plainly. Second is the law of double reference. This law states that often a block of Scripture is speaking of 2 different persons or 2 different events that are separated by a long period of time. So the issue is that these 2 events or people are blended into one and can be very difficult to distinguish. Additionally, we often don't see a time gap when blending these events together, but this is something done often in prophecy. Now, it's important to note that this is not double fulfillment. This is not the idea that the author only intended one meaning, but then it gained this later fulfillment at a different time. No, they're two distinct people, two distinct events. They're blended, but they're not equivalent. So it's important to understand there's a difference between this and double fulfillment. Okay, it's not two meanings. The author would have intended and understood both meanings initially, that piece of text was referring to two different people and two different events that have been blended into one for the sake of prophetic verse. They would have understood it from the beginning. So again, not double fulfillment, where you get literally the text means one thing and then you read it again and the whole text means something else. This is a blending. Third is the law of recurrence. In some passages of Scripture, there exists the recording of an event followed by a second reading of the same event, giving more details to the first. A great example of this can be found in Joshua, Judges, where you see battles take place, and then they'll actually give you summaries of the battles, and sometimes they'll even differ. And they differ because they're summaries. So you'll see that. Scripture will comment one way, and then essentially it will recapitulate later. This happens also in Revelation. The fourth rule is the rule of context. This is a simple one. This simply means don't take the verse out of context. If the verse is written to a certain person or group of people, you can't pull it out of context and apply it to somebody else. So we always have to understand the context of the verses that we're going to, and really we have to understand the context within the chapter, the whole book, and the whole canonical Bible. Now, in terms of interpretive methods for the book of Revelation, there are a few. First is the allegorical interpretation. This essentially states that the book of Revelation is not historical, that actually it's simply a metaphor, or an allegory, or a symbol, or an extended metaphor. In other words, it just refers to people's spiritual states and the struggle between good and evil that we've undergone since the beginning of time. Okay, this has clearly been rejected by the majority of Christianity, but some people are starting to reassert it now. This originally came from the Alexandrian Church, which was often regarded as heretical and denied millennial readings of the text. Second and more common is a preterist approach. A preterist approach can be full or partial. A full preterist asserts that the entirety of the book of Revelation happened prior to and in 70 AD. Thus, the second coming of Christ is denied as a future event, the final resurrection is denied, and the final judgment is denied. This is a heretical position as it denies central tenets of Christianity. Partial preterism asserts that all of those events still will happen, but the majority of the book of Revelation, the tribulational aspect, happened to the early church during the reign of the initial emperors of Rome in the church age. This has the unfortunate effect of making the prophecy essentially irrelevant to later church ages. It also makes it so the prophecies referring more to what I would call localized events as opposed to events that are truly important to the entire church. Third, there's the historical view. The historical view sees the book of Revelation as talking about the entire age of the church. And so we're in this period now and these things are sort of happening. They also take a post-millennial approach whereby the church is forced to endure the tribulation and suffer along with the rest of the world. Finally, there's the futurist approach. It's the one that I hold and the one we'll be using. It holds to all of the above mentioned, or the aforementioned interpretive principles, and I believe it does the best justice to the text. So in conclusion, I've argued for John as being the author, the disciple John. I've argued for a 95 AD dating of the text during the reign of Domitian, not during the reign of Nero. And I have also argued for a futurist interpretation, although we didn't get into the details, but I've at least presented it in the other views and told you which one we're going to be going for. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope this is beneficial. I hope this really helps you get more out of the sermons that we'll be doing. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and to discussing things with you guys soon. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and please enjoy the rest of your church service if you are part of our church.